All right, and welcome everybody to another episode of Terms Defined Socialism. We've decided to go a second episode in because the last episode we spent a lot of time talking about economics, which was very good and very interesting, I thought. So please, everybody, watch the older video. It's in the Terms Defined playlist there on YouTube. And so once again, we're bringing back special guest Eugene Bagashov, who has some insight into this sort of stuff. Now, he's from Belarus, and he's not only my favorite Belarusian, but he's also my favorite theoretical particle physicist. How's your PhD program going, Eugene?
Hello, everyone. Well, my PhD program kind of sucks, but it's all my fault. So,
Well, why does it
uh,
suck, man?
well, because I'm not devoting as much of effort as needed to it. So,
I see.
as I said, it's my fault only.
My best friend has a PhD, and I understand what's involved and how you can be delayed for years because of very, very minor things. So don't sweat it.
Well, okay. Well, I'm trying. Basically, that's what I'm saying.
Anyway,
But
so
it's not there yet. Yeah.
anyway, we wanted to get back and talk more about socialism, especially the misconceptions, because not that we glossed over it, but we should have probably spent more time on it because I think it's pretty. I think it's awfully popular now. And again, Eugene's got some insight into this because Eugene believes Belarus to be the most Soviet of the former Soviet states. So he probably has lots of insight into the history of things like the Bolshevik Revolution that I've never even considered or heard of. I'm sure he knows more about Trotsky than I do. Put it that way.
Yeah, actually, if we're talking about Trotsky, even though it's already a digression, but anyway, if you actually Stalin, this kind of famous imagery of Stalin as this sort of dictator in a military outfit, sort of like strict kind of guy, he actually borrowed it from Trotsky. So Trotsky was the first guy who kind of implemented this imagery, and then everyone else, like fascists like Mussolini and Stalin, they just copied Trotsky basically in terms of this media image.
Ah,
Um, but
okay.
then Stalin killed Trotsky, obviously, when he was in immigration in Mexico. So they sent a dude there who killed Trotsky. But anyway, but Trotsky was really a horrible guy. Like, he was much worse than Stalin himself. Like, he killed a lot of people. He was super terroristically oriented, and he was just a horrible wreck of
Ah,
a
yes.
person.
Yes, I wasn't attempting to glorify Trotsky. I was just bringing him up as a random Bolshevik. Uh, he got killed with an ice axe while in exile,
Yes,
if I
yes,
remember correctly,
yes, in Mexico by Mikander, I think was
by
the
like
last name.
essentially the KGB, right?
Yeah, well, sort of, yeah, probably.
Anyway, so let's just do a brief explanation of what socialism is. Um, you know, whether it's an economic policy or a political policy.
Yeah, so, well, the main point, as we've talked about previously, is that the state controls most of the production, essentially, and there's more or less central planning involved. So, again, some bureaucrats decide what the state is going to produce, what the people are going to consume, etc., etc. It's that kind of system. And so it's not the market, like the supply and demand, that determines the balance of the economy, but it's the central planners who decide, basically.
Yeah, and let me
What it,
just let me just digress to get even kind of I guess sort of in history even before that. A lot of people consider the U.S. to be a capitalist state and so on, and I take exception to that because of a law enacted in 1913, known as the Federal Reserve Act, very famously signed into law by Woodrow Wilson. On
yeah, Wilson was a hell of a statist himself,
yeah,
because,
on
like,
December.
if you read what he wrote about the role of the president, he basically described himself as a dictator. Like, seriously, just read what he wrote about himself. I mean, as the president, it's just horrible. Like,
Yeah, and
seriously.
the Federal Reserve Act, even Wilson regretted the Federal Reserve Act, probably largely because of the effects on sovereignty and monetary policy that it has, basically it takes power away from the government. I mean, Alan Greenspan famously stated that the Federal Reserve does not answer to the government. It's more appropriate to say the government answers the Federal Reserve, because if interest rates go up, the government has to spend less money due to percentage of GDP and so on. And so I think it's a very important thing to understand that when people are saying end capitalism, we don't have capitalism.
Yeah, I would agree. And well, again, speaking about history, it's a very long debate that you had in the U.S. about whether the state needs the federal government, needs the central bank or not. And it goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers. So Jefferson was famously against the central bank. He was like, in modern terms, he was a libertarian kind of guy, whereas the opposing party, again, was more of a socialistic oriented, even though socialism wasn't even a thing back then, let's say in the beginning of 19th century.
Right, Hamilton,
for
central
Hamilton,
banks.
I think he was for the central bank.
Correct.
And he's on like $10 bill or
the $10 bill. Yep.
Okay. Wow. I actually
Andy
got it right.
Andy Samberg and Chris Parnell, famously known for stating that you can call them Aaron Burr from the way they're dropping Hamiltons. They're talking about $10 bills, not Benjamins, because they're not paid. They're only paid hundreds of thousands a year instead of millions a year, so they're complaining about how they're dropping $10 bills at the movie theater.
Okay.
It's a good skit though. Lazy Sunday. Check it out sometime.
All right.
Anyway, it's not as lazy as the ideas of socialism. So
there was some other thing you talked about, and I kind of forgot because of this digression.
I don't know, it'll come back to
it was about the Fed, and you said that the U.S. is not a capitalist country, really. And I would agree, because if you look at the U.S. budget, it's like 60% or maybe more devoted to Social Security. So it's really socialistic kind of budget.
I think military spending is higher than that, but without looking it up.
Military spending is only a few percent, dude. It's not 60% as Social Security. Yeah, and the fact that you need to shut down your government almost every year, at the beginning of new fiscal year in November, whatever, December, you probably are going to have another shutdown this year.
Well, that's just because they always find reasons to spend more money,
exactly.
It's a thing that's not understood, especially by socialists.
Needs more money because it's overspending, and it means that you're not a really free market economy anymore.
And every time it needs new money, it doesn't have any. It prints money It prints money out of thin air, which it borrows. Well, the Fed prints it out of thin air, which it borrows from. And without getting again into the whole economic situation.
But
and don't let me interrupt you.
Okay. What? I'm sorry. I thought you wanted to interrupt me, but anyway.
No, let me interrupt you, but don't let me lose your train of thought.
Yeah. Okay. So Fed can print any amount of money they need, certainly, but firstly, the government should decide to allow itself to borrow this money. So every year you have this situation where government overspends and it decides, well, okay, let's lift the the ceiling of possible debt a little bit more and borrow some more money from the Fed, basically.
Yeah, I think the last budget was actually during the Bush administration at some point. So we have not had a budget since then, which means every quarter, typically, we pass another omnibus bill, which typically includes all kinds of things which make the government even bigger each time. So there's all kinds of stuff slipped into each bill. And it hasn't been a budget for at least a few years, several years.
Probably, yeah. But anyway, so you were certainly the U.S. economy enjoys this possibility to produce money out of thin air, essentially, because all of the world basically acknowledges the U.S. dollar as the primary reserve currency, and so you can basically just piggyback on all of the world, basically. So yeah,
I
I
don't know
mean, if
about
my country
I don't
prints
know
a lot
about
of money,
piggyback, but yeah, what you're stating is that people have confidence that the dollar will be worth something in the future.
yeah, and it's actually very justified. I mean, this is the reality we're in. I mean, if the actually when, because it's not if but when, I would state, the next crisis comes, and because of the corona stuff, we're going to have a huge depression worldwide, and China might go bankrupt and whatever. I mean, just the whole world would crumble because of that. But anyway, so when the next crisis comes, since most of the world's debt is nominated in dollars, and that's maybe like 60 or 70% of the world's debt, it means that everyone would need dollars to repay the debt, you know. But so there would be what economists call short squeeze on dollars. And what it means is, well, okay, so short position on the market is when you're selling something, long position is when you're buying. So there would be how would you say it? Not enough of short positions on dollars. So there would be basically a shortage of dollars on the market because everyone needs dollars to repay their debts, etc. And the U.S. is basically the only agency that can provide dollars to
Well,
people.
if you have a glut of short sales, you'll have a glut of dollars, and if you have a shortage, you'll have an increase in the price of dollars. But yeah, I understand what you're
Exactly.
saying.
So again, if I am to provide any sort of investment advice, I would say that you should either keep dollars or gold. Those are
Oh yeah,
basically.
yeah. In terms of other world currencies, if you have a choice between yen or euros or any other major fiat currency besides dollars, you would be out of your gourd to pick anything besides dollars because and as far as like markets are going on, the likelihood that the store down the street's going to burn down is probably slightly lower in the U.S. too than most other places. So
Yeah.
as far as investments, like I understand the idea that there's a huge amount of money to be made in emerging markets by investing there instead of in the U.S. for very cheap amounts, and that's great because a lot of the places that are obviously very cheap to invest in are very lucrative. But as far as stable investments go, even the U.S. stock market, I mean, but seriously though, especially currency, like exactly like what you were saying, the U.S. dollar is just vastly superior, and of course, gold and silver, I would agree, are vastly superior to the U.S. dollar. And I have about zero confidence in cryptocurrency, if anybody's wondering.
Well, unfortunately, at the moment, it's more of an again speculative investment.
Right, right.
Again, it was sort of a dream for again all those libertarian-minded people that Bitcoin might actually be the thing, so to speak. But
Yeah, yeah.
right now, Bitcoin is just again another investment bubble, just like oil or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, and
So
I'm not against it as a speculative investment, but the idea that it's gonna like replace regular old currency like fiat currency this year, it's just not stable enough to do that. So anyway, let's get back to misconceptions about socialism, right?
yeah,
It's
totally.
it's very very popular right now, and kids of all different ages are all stoked about socialism, and they're wishing that Bernie Sanders could get a law passed so that they could vote at age 8 for president and things like this. What's the situation like in Belarus, for instance?
Yeah, it's actually understandable. I wish to comment on your small remark here that kids are very excited about socialism, and I was very excited when I was young.
I was a leftist,
Uh,
also.
yeah, of course. And again, there's a saying, and I believe it's 100% true, that something to the effect that if you're not a socialist when you're 16, you don't have a heart, but if you're not a conservative when you're 30, you don't have a brain.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
it's, yeah, because, well, people observe all the, unfairness of the world, etc. And when they're young, they want to make things right, to deliver the wealth to the poor, etc. So they become socialists, and it's completely understandable. But when they actually learn how economy works, when they join the workforce on their own, I mean, in their own lives. So they start to see that actually capitalism make people wealthier rather than poorer. Then they understand that probably socialism is not the best idea, you know. So yeah,
I
it's
concur.
completely understandable that the youth is more into socialism. And again, all these, you know, proverbial U.S. college campuses who are like 99% socialistic or leftist at the very least.
Right.
It's understandable because yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know what it's like in Belarus, but I didn't take a macroeconomics course until probably freshman year of college. I took a night class, macroeconomics 101. Up until then, I didn't know anything about it. And until even after I was through being a day trader, I still didn't truly understand economics until I understood banking and the Federal Reserve and, well, central banking in general.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my country, you see, it's kind of a difficult situation because our government is actually kind of socialistic and pretty socialistic, I would say. So people have a hard time reconciling it all. So
Right.
basically, socialists can't really have an upper hand because the government is already socialistic. So ultimately, what socialists say in my country is that it's just the wrong type of socialism. You know, just
Sure,
like
sure. We have to make
you
the
know,
government bigger because reasons, right?
yeah, not just bigger, but you have to make the government different. Like the government already controls everything here, but they say it controls it badly. So basically, you need to replace all the bureaucrats that are currently in power with better bureaucrats. Basically, that's what they're saying. Whereas the adepts of the free market, such as myself, for example, we're just saying let's just lessen the powers of the government in the first place. So
Right,
yeah.
right. And which brings me to another point, which is often brought up in, particularly in moronic Facebook arguments. I see this all the time. People put up a meme and it shows construction crews building roads, police, fire, border security, space exploration, national defense forces, and it says, oh noes, it's socialism. But really, in reality, no libertarian in the world, like, I guess there's some total anarchists who think there should be none of those things, but 99% of libertarians who haven't been a libertarian for less than 5 minutes are not out there saying we shouldn't spend money on border security or police, fire, ambulance, and road building services. There are some things that are simply too expensive and too complicated or too whatever for private organizations to be able to seek a profit doing, right?
Well, I'm actually this very radical type of libertarian. I'm an anarcho-capitalist, and I do believe that all those things you've listed can be solved by the private markets, private property. We can have a disagreement here, but again, if, in terms of police force, I think actually an interesting example was in Britain relatively recently when they've implemented a private police. And it wasn't actually on the news that much, but they did. And the private police was actually much better than the actual government employed police force.
You often do find
So
that to be the case when there's a financial incentive that you end up with a better sort of result because you end up with less waste and more innovation, certainly. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was information about this, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was very difficult to find said information.
well, I can definitely, from my own personal experience, I can definitely tell you that, well, I am, as a researcher, employed by the government, essentially. I'm receiving wages which completely are out of, like, they don't at all depend on what I do. So I just receive, like, a certain paycheck, which is basically trash. Like, I'm almost at the bottommost 5% of the population in terms of wages. Like
Okay.
literally cleaning the streets, sweeping the streets, I would receive more money. That's why I'm so careless about my job, basically, because
Oh,
it's not
geez.
giving me anything
Well,
in
what?
terms of money. So, but when I receive a certain contract for doing something really tangible, and I know that I receive this money for doing this, I'm much more motivated, like just orders of magnitude more motivated, and I enjoy doing that because I know I do this stuff for these people and they give me money for that, and it's such more fulfilling, and I don't know, it's just incomparable with what I receive from the government. It's just
Can you elaborate on that a little further?
well, for example, I'm currently I have a bunch of contracts on editing papers for a journal.
Oh,
So
okay.
I just need to basically well, they send me a raw version of a paper, and I need to fit it into the journal's format, right? So all
I
the
see. Okay.
pictures would be where they should be, etc. So
Right,
there would be
right.
no mistakes in formulas, etc.
Ah,
So and they pay me money for that, and I enjoy that because, well, it's a hard work, really. I mean, like one paper can take you a whole day to edit. I mean, it sounds kind of easy, but it really isn't. I mean, it's really exhausting, but I enjoy that because I know that this is the work I need to do, and this is the money they're paying me for it. Whereas on my regular job, I just receive a certain money and I can do nothing, basically, and I'm not motivated at all to do anything because
yes. And you've
the
brought us
money is
back to
going to be there
socialism.
anyway, even though.
Right.
So my basic incentive at my regular job is just to try to evade responsibility as much as possible, right?
Yeah, yeah. You
To try to make the other
Yep.
guy do the thing
I get
I'm
that.
forced to do.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, and
Right.
it's just so transparent.
It's
It's
very
so
Soviet.
obvious.
It's very, very Soviet.
Yeah, exactly.
Now,
So any bureaucratic system, its first and foremost incentive is to evade responsibility, evade tasks that you bring
right,
up
right.
to it, etc. So, and on the market, it's the very opposite. That like the people want to work because you're paying them for this. If they don't work, they're not receiving any money, so they want to work.
So let me just interrupt you for a second before we get back to socialism here. Happy Independence Day. I'm in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania here.
Oh, right.
And are
We
you
actually,
are you able to see my screen? It's feeling kind of warm. I think I feel a hot spot here.
yeah, you're a little
It's I'm
baby
trying
Ragnar.
I'm trying
Uh,
to I'm putting this beer on my hand. That feels better, but every time I look, it looks like there's a. I think my hair might have started on fire, man. I don't know.
yeah, yeah.
It's kind of
You're
weird.
hot, dude.
It's kind of.
Okay. Anyway, it's very funny. I just wanted to comment on this because yesterday, on July 3rd, we had our Independence Day because well,
Happy belated.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's actually very stupid because it's the very recent decision under the current government that they made. Because July 3rd of 1944 was when my city, Minsk, the capital, was liberated, or in air quotes, liberated from the Nazis by the
Okay.
Soviets, which
Right.
many people don't consider as a true liberation. But anyway,
Right. Right.
uh,
Just
so
a change of which tyrant was in control.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Uh,
Yeah. Okay, so what other misconceptions have we? There's got to be more. The idea that the whole thing, the word socialism. A lot of people think that means like being social. What's up with that? Have you ever heard this one?
I don't think so. I think it's some stupid rhetorical device. But
Yeah.
anyway, what I really wanted to talk about with regards to misconceptions is the idea that, for example, under socialism, your society would be more equal, in terms of income, in terms of possibilities and wealth. Well, it's actually not true. And if you look at again, it's a very serious statement against government control of economy, etc. If you look at the Gini index, Gini, it's the last name of some Italian economist. But
Hmm.
basically, what Gini index shows
I've
is
never heard of that one.
it's a numerical measure of inequalities. So how less of a population, let's say, receives most of the wealth, for example, like how unequal is your society in terms of income.
Like
So
inequality as per amount of wealth that exists, or something like that.
yeah, amount of wealth with respect to the amount of people who receive it,
I
basically,
see.
or have it. So high Gini index means high inequality, and low Gini index means more equality,
Okay.
roughly speaking. So the countries with more government control and less economic freedom have higher Gini index, so they have higher inequality, and you can check that. Just look at the, for example, World Bank data on Gini index. It's really easy to find.
Like
And
Brazil
compare.
or
Yes,
Venezuela.
exactly, and compare that to the, for example, Index of Economic Freedom published by Cato Institute, one of the, roughly speaking, libertarian organizations. And you would see that there is an inverse correlation between Gini index and economic freedom. So the more economic freedom you have, the less inequality you have. So it's very weird in terms of socialistic reasoning, but it's very understandable in terms of free market reasoning because, well, the more freedom you
Yeah.
have, the less possibilities there are for corruption, for example, because you don't have a large government that can, pay for its cronies and its friends and lobbyists. So yeah, you have more equality.
Right.
So
Well,
it's a very serious problem for socialists, and they don't seem to even be aware of it in the first place.
it is weird. They think that there's mysterious deep pockets that just don't exist. And
Yeah, when people say that, we have 1% of the world population which is super rich, well, then you should look for it. Like, why are they super rich? All these bankers, why are the bankers super rich? Is because they are supported by the central banks who just give them money, out again, as we've said, out of the thin air. So
yeah, pretty much.
you don't have central banks. There's no money to be made out of thin air anymore. So all the bankers go bankrupt if they're reckless with their investments, which they are mostly.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
and they go broke and they just jump out of their stupid towers, and kill themselves.
A lot of people believe that the reason that the West dislikes Syria is because Syria is a country that has no central bank.
Well, I don't think it's well. Again, I've stated this in one of my videos. There's a conspiracy theory about that, like why is the U.S. involved in this Middle East thing in the first place? Is that the Americans feel they don't have as much history as this place, so they want to, kind of get in touch with all this ancient stuff, all this Babylon, whatever, you know.
Oh, really?
Palmyra, like in
Oh boy.
Syria, etc. Yeah. But again, it's just a conspiracy theory.
Man, it's pretty hot in Pennsylvania today. I went riding earlier, and I don't know. I guess it'll be good for grilling.
Seems so. Yeah.
We're gonna make
Just
some
don't
wings.
get grilled yourself.
I won't. So, anything else you want to cover? Plug? Any ideas about your next Eugene the Philosopher video?
Oh, my next video is going to be about the boring world. I think I would call it. It's about, well, basically, when some people come up and say, "Oh, I've discovered the secrets of everything. Like the world is a spiral or something. The
Oh,
world
yeah, yeah.
can be described by the golden ratio number."
The
So
number 9 is
some,
the answer to
yeah,
everything. Yeah, yeah.
pi or whatever.
Some 42.
Some stupid geometrical intuition or some stupid number, and they think they can describe everything with it. And my point is that I find it heavily boring. Like it's just one-dimensional
Yeah.
vision of the world. The world is so much more complex than those idiots can imagine, and it's just boring.
Eugene, so are you willing to say here on Terms Defined, Socialism Part 2, whatever it is, Misconceptions, are you willing to say here that it's possible that the answer to life, the universe, and everything is not 42 and that you must pack a towel?
Must pack a towel? What does it mean? It's like when you're going to the beach or something.
Well, it's just because a towel is such a useful object. But is it
Uh,
possible?
I genuinely think that when you go to 200 motels, you should steal towels from each one of them. That's what I would say. It's your personal, how would you say it, impact on the society. It's your personal fight for socialism against capitalism.
It
You
depends.
need to steal towels, and you also probably need to steal silverware, if
Oh,
you can, if there
jeez.
is any.
Oh boy. That's a case for socialism. What? How
Yeah,
does that?
exactly. Fight the system,
Yeah,
harm the poor.
fight the system, man. Throw some water balloons at the police and then launch
Oh,
fireworks at them and get
exactly,
shot. Fight
exactly.
the system, man. That's gonna
Yeah,
accomplish a lot. Your political
totally.
goals will totally get achieved this way.
Yeah. Oh, there was one thing when we talked about the possibility of a private police force.
Hmm. I'm not
There's
anti
an
it. I'm not anti it, but it requires a lot of responsible people.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there was a Belgian thinker, Gustavo Molinari, who said in the middle of the 19th century, so a very long time ago, he actually theoretically showed how you can have well, what is police force? It's ultimately it provides you safety, right? So safety is what you're paying for, essentially, when you're paying to the police.
Yeah, I
So
guess there's a
he
deterrent
showed
factor and there's the investigation of crimes.
Well, it's ultimately safety anyway. Well, why is the investigation? Why does it matter? It's because the people who are responsible for some bad stuff get punished eventually.
Right.
So everyone knows that, and they don't do this bad stuff
Maybe.
because
Hopefully.
of that.
We're hoping.
So Gustavo Molinari have shown that it is possible to achieve the provision of safety on the free market, and you don't need government for that, basically. And again, it's very old. I mean, people just don't know about this. And there's a bunch of, well, there's sort of a debate in a libertarian community between what is called minarchists. So, well, it means minimal archy, right? Minimal power. So they're saying, oh, the government should provide police force and the courts and everything else should be governed by the free market. Whereas ANCAPs, anarcho-capitalists, are saying, no, the free market can actually provide everything. So these are two different branches of libertarian movement. And I'm more of an anarcho-capitalist kind. I'm saying, no, the courts can be private, the police force can be private. There's only a very few issues on where there is a serious problem in libertarian thinking, and those issues are, for example, children. Like, how can you what should you do with children? Because you see, libertarianism works with free individuals, like subjects, but children aren't really free individuals and subjects. So what should you do with them? Like, are the children sort of property, roughly speaking, of their parents, or like what? How can we treat them? And it's a serious problem, like seriously. And I have a video, Two Problems of Libertarianism, where I talk about it. So yeah, it's a very serious problem. And another serious problem of libertarianism is, for example, stuff like nuclear weapons. Like, should you allow personal
Or geoengineering and
possession of nuclear weapons and things like that? Because under extreme anarcho-capitalist libertarianism, you can say, yeah, why not? But at the same time, well, you can see a lot of reasons why not,
Sure.
because what one crazy psycho with a nuclear bomb is a serious problem for the society.
Have you ever? Which reminds me, have you ever looked into what happens when you launch a nuke into space? The reason that test ban treaties were enacted, from what I understand, is actually because of space detonations, which are even worse and weirder than ground detonations, because of the effect that they have on the magnetosphere. They create little electron clouds that just hang out in the same spot for weeks and cause big striations in the magnetosphere.
Yeah, and it's actually an interesting point. And by the way, maybe your viewers would be interested in that. And it might actually reinforce the lunar hoax conspiracy theory, because in the 60s, I'm not.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised.
I'm not for it. I think the Americans actually went to the moon, but anyway, it's my personal opinion. But in the 60s, there were many explosions in space or at high altitude of nuclear devices.
Yeah.
So Van Allen belts in the 60s were much thicker because of that, because of the all the charged particles released during these explosions were feeding Van Allen belts.
Yeah,
So
sure.
all the protons and electrons released during these explosions, they remained there. And yeah, it's actually a serious thing. Like,
Yeah, they would have charge separated at the Van Allen belts, and a bunch of plasma would have gotten deflected into the plasmasphere. Some of it would have caused chemical reactions around the Van Allen belts and ionosphere. Other electrons
yeah,
would have gotten stuck in the Van Allen belts and stayed there and strengthened them. Yeah, all kinds of weird stuff would happen.
yeah. I
It's
actually
bizarre.
read well, there was one paper in 2015, I think. It was called, and it was actually a brilliant concept in my opinion. It was called anthropogenic space weather.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah,
was
yep.
talking about these impacts of human beings onto our immediate, environment, like with radio waves, like how radio waves
Sure.
impact the Van Allen belts and magnetosphere and whatnot. And in particular, there was one huge segment of this paper devoted to these space explosions of nuclear
Okay.
rockets and stuff. And
Nice.
starfish experiment in 1965, I think, or something, at I think 400 kilometers altitude. So what it did, it actually killed literally a couple of satellites. So there was only maybe 5 or 7 satellites at the time around the Earth. In again 1965 or something, maybe 62 even. I don't exactly remember, but it actually, those charged particles that it released into the magnetosphere destroyed a couple of satellites. So yeah, it was a serious thing.
And you know what?
And
Without a giant government, you couldn't have possibly done those experiments. But guess what? With sound businesses, you would have still had those satellites probably.
yeah, I think so too. But anyway,
Just to kind
one
of bring
other
it
thing
back, it's a callback there.
one other thing I wanted to mention with
Yeah, yeah.
regards to space exploration and nuclear energy. Again, I have a video about nuclear energy, where I talk about it in some more detail. But I just want to briefly mention that it's really stupid that we don't allow nuclear energy to be used in space. And there's a lot of regulations about it, especially in the European Union, but a little bit less in the United States or Japan. But
I didn't even know
anyway,
that was a thing.
well, Europe really doesn't appreciate nuclear energy in space. But if you think about it, nuclear energy is the way to go in terms of space exploration. Like if you
Yeah.
would have a lunar base, let's say, how would you provide energy for it? Well, the nuclear energy is the only way to go, because it will, just think about it. The solar panels is not a way to go, because,
A
well, they have
nuclear
a night
sub.
for 2 weeks.
Yeah, a
For
nuclear
two
sub.
weeks they don't have daylight at all. So uh,
A nuclear sub's commissioned for what, 18 years on its fissile material or something like that?
I don't know, but if you look at the most successful space exploration, like especially deep space exploration missions, I mean, beyond Mars, you pretty much your solar panels don't do jack shit, because there's no sunlight. It's too far from the
Right.
sun. So Juno is actually the only, I think, deep space mission with the solar panels. And just look at them; they're so huge that, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. But every other successful deep space mission involved radioactive isotope generators,
Hmm.
retakes. Like, think about Galileo space probe to Jupiter, Cassini, probably what the best success, the best deep space mission of all, to Saturn.
Yeah, it's
Then
pretty good.
New Horizons is on retakes. Even Curiosity rover is on retake. That's why it's still operating.
So what would be
Whereas those two
what's the argument?
Spirit and Opportunity probes already died because they worked on solar panels. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Well, what's the reasoning behind banning nuclear isotope power in spacecraft? What is it? The
it
implications of what happens on the ground, or
it's
is it
purely political. It's just stupid.
wonderful?
Again, people are afraid that some nuclear, I mean, if there is a malfunction, some, I mean,
On
radioactive
launch.
stuff would fall on their heads, basically.
On launch. But once it's
sort of,
beyond
yeah.
launch, it's see you later. It's not gonna. The likely.
Yeah.
It's not gonna.
And again, it's such a low dose anyway. If it even explodes on just at the launching pad, it's not gonna kill anyone. It's not gonna harm anyone. So it's completely stupid, and yeah, I'm just baffled by it.
Man. All right, so one last question while I have you here. Any predictions on what the Solar Orbiter 2 is going to figure out?
Y2, I think it's just Solar Orbiter.
Isn't it the second one? I thought it was the ESA's second. Anyway, the ESA's Solar Orbiter.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a good thing that they tried to increase its inclination, so it would probably be able to see the solar poles a bit better than otherwise. But at the same time, it's not a very high inclination. It's like 30 degrees, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, what do you think would happen if they would fly something right over the top of the pole? Do you think it would get destroyed by a giant proton beam, or?
There was a mission, Ulysses space probe. So what they did was you have to sort of understand orbital mechanics a little bit to understand what was going on. But they initially launched the probe to Jupiter, and they used Jupiter's gravity assist to heavily change its orbital inclination around the sun. So it was like 87 degrees or something inclination. So it was almost perpendicular to the ecliptic in the end, but it still was quite far away from the solar poles. But it gathered a lot of useful. Simply because of the size of its orbit in the first place. I mean, it was going all the way from 1 astronomical unit at perihelion, roughly speaking, where Earth is, where it was launched from, to 5 astronomical units at aphelion, where Jupiter is, right? So it was a huge orbit, and even if it was slightly inclined away from perpendicular, it was still very far away from straight perpendicular to the sun's surface. So, but anyway, so it found quite a lot of interesting things. Especially, it was operating for more than a solar cycle, I think, and gathered a lot of data in terms of solar wind speed at different latitudes and things like that. So it was kind of a cool mission. And I'm not sure Solar Orbiter would achieve anything like that because, well, firstly, it's going to be pretty far from the sun. So in this respect, Parker Solar Probe is much more interesting. Because it really goes closer to the sun, like below the orbit of Mercury in the first place. So Solar Orbiter is mostly about visual.
It's about imagery, getting images of the solar polar areas.
So maybe something would be found, but I'm not very optimistic about it. Again, Parker Probe already delivered some very interesting things. Like they've discovered those, what they call switchbacks in the solar wind.
Yeah.
I'm actually baffled that we're talking about this in the video about socialism.
Well, I guess this is one of the achievements of socialism, because another misconception is that it's all bad, right?
Yeah.
And indeed, to harken back to the days of Karl Marx, the idealism of the concept that centralized control can work hinges on no corruption. And I think if you had no corruption, it would be fine, because nobody would care what anybody got paid, and nobody would use their power to the detriment of others.
Yeah, well, it's a typical sentiment of socialists. They're saying firstly, socialism was never tried, as we know. I mean, tongue-in-cheek sort of way. And secondly, this was a wrong socialism. Next time we'll build the right one, Of course, every time. But anyway, so they've discovered with Parker Probe what they call switchbacks, which is like a fast changes in magnetic field direction, interplanetary magnetic field, so solar wind, basically.
Yeah, we talked about it half a dozen
times.
Direction.
And I believe if you interpret this in Alfvén's terms, Hannes Alfvén, not in terms of magnetic fields, but in terms of circuits and currents. These are current sheets. So there are electric current sheets in the solar wind on a small scale.
Oh
So
yeah, I'd agree.
they're saying these switchbacks occur on a time scale of few seconds, basically, or maybe tens of seconds. So the solar wind is not a medium, it's not like an aquarium, like a water or something flow. It's actually a very complex set of structures. And
Possibly like pulsating tides or something on a three-dimensional scale or something like that.
yeah, and it just reinforces this idea again of Alfvén and many others that plasma just spontaneously tends to create structures. It doesn't like to be homogeneous at
True.
all. So if you have, let's say, two regions of plasma with different temperature, you wouldn't have a slow, smooth transition from one temperature to the other. Rather, what you would have is two almost like reservoirs of the same temperature and a small structure in between them, like a double layer or a current sheet or whatever.
Yeah, I agree.
So this is what happens in plasma. And
Yep.
it's, again...
Not all things... Not all things in cosmology are electric, but those particular interactions indeed are. I would concur with you there.
Yeah, well, again, everything is electric is one of those sentiments, one of those statements that I would call a part of the boring world.
Yeah, don't do it.
Described. Everything is electric is as good as nothing is electric. Like, it really doesn't explain anything at all.
Yeah, styrofoam universe and universe only of electrons. Neither one is a thing. Anyway.
Should we finish?
Yeah. Anything else about socialism, Eugene? We got to close this out.
I don't think so. Like, I can speak about it for hours, but I don't think it's needed at the moment.
Yeah, maybe we'll do more later, but I think perhaps some other interesting terms to find will strike our fancy before that.
Yes. Well, to sum it up, main misconceptions about socialism is that, well, firstly, it brings equality. That's a misconception. I've already said that no, it's actually the freer economies have less inequality than socialistic centralized economies.
By practically every measure, whether it's among the sexes or among the races or among even income brackets.
It doesn't matter.
It's almost all of them. It's almost it's on practically any metric. More socialism makes more per capita inequality.
Yeah, totally. And another thing I wanted to repeat from the previous video is this idea of Mises, Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist, which I think is very true. And it's about the economic calculation in socialism. So he argued that in socialism, you cannot have an economic calculation because you don't have price mechanism. So on free market, the price shows to the producers what they should produce. So if something is very high in price, if something is very expensive, then people tend to produce more of that because they can make profits.
Yeah,
because
incentive.
People need this stuff. So more of the people are going to do this stuff for them, to produce whatever it is. Whereas in socialism, you have, or vice versa, if the price is too low, then less people are going to produce it, right?
Sure.
Whereas in socialism, you have price control. The government controls the prices, and which incentivizes people to overproduce stuff that people don't need if the price is set too high versus the market, or not produce stuff that people really need if the price is too low set by the government again. So the whole economy gets fooled in a way by this price regulation, and you have, again, deficit of things that people really need and overabundance of things that nobody needs. Again, the example, USSR, just study the consumer preferences in the USSR and the availability of stuff in the USSR. Like, people didn't have decent clothes, people didn't have decent food, like meat was a rarity. But at the same time, you had a bunch of tanks and rockets and whatever. And so this is what you end up if you control prices. So Okay, that was probably the main point against socialism.
All right, man. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to Eugene's channel, Eugene the Philosopher. That's philosopher with a T. And
Yeah, with a T.
I corrected it. It's on the screen.
Boston Tea Party, so to speak.
Yeah. So, yeah, I got to get going and see if I can put these flames out, and I'll get this uploaded soon. And don't be a stranger. I'm sure I'll talk to you soon, Eugene. Thanks again for coming in.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And, yeah, see you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye, viewers.